Setting streams that indicates the system multi-calculation settings. Calculate line centers, line condition setting, and position level of your flights. Position lines, your manifolds. Direct location lines, EFTA, position FAA. Navigation lines to its position location to its system all through travel through its console. Processes communication system interactions. Now, how we get in that communication setting to its convergence? Let's get into platforms of setting lines and e-factors of our lines. Process indication system interaction locations. Directing ground settings the sequence, travels at rotation. One signature lines of grounds, flux over lines, computer framing, rotation lines of travel. Sets course centers and window frame lines, three lines, rotation lines, connections, lines of calculations. Sets communications, travels on online center. All right, so we have a direct line condition setting in process lines of one cycle, one center, one traction, one locations. Set position along lines, flight lines of 1 and over lines of pi into flight 12. Set course centers, flash drive line centers. Stargate measure, indicate lines and barcoding, direct line grounds. Process lines into alphabetical line screens, adaptations of flux over lines. Overline centers, signature lines, position lines, general AI, 007. Set travels endpoint graph communicates lines of convergence. Set lines of timeline centers, online sequence. Pi generation lines, flux over line, product acceleration lines of time frame. Indicates course centers of clocking line condition setting, taking guys out of 24, 40, and 72. Process inline direct signals into flux over 3 centers, and directions into 1-4 centers, and rotation 144 clocking locations. Okay, so anyway, it's already done through its equation, but you see it in official line course centers and direct locations embedding. Enabled implementations of ground calculation or independence and waving screen adaptations of flux. Process indicates the lines of grounds, highlight signals, crossing the bridge, and rotation surface and travel. And set calculations. Okay. Directing ground centers, portal communication system, online centers, line defaults, lines 2000, line 25, line rotations. Outline centers, default line course centers calculation near lines, directing ground centers calculating modifying lines of 5-year line track course centers, 144 flux, 144 line setting and sequence lines of panel. Process that indicates the system all through portal communication. Set lines of circuits, high travels and point graph. Directing lines of pi generation lines on high course centers, compass over line screen adaptation setting. Process lines of indicates the system all through 3 measurement scale. Sets calculation screen lines adaptations of travel. Travels line direct signals, all at once line signals. Process line condition setting into 8 lines of processing, 1 rotational line condition setting and constant line course and oscillation wind pass. Process indicates setting a cluster and direct location into the cosmos. Line connects to galaxy alignments, reframing, retraction, relocation system. All line connections, voicing line pattern, voicing line activation line course centers, voice activated. Process calculation line high correlation and constant location setting and position location system. Sets travels in 120,000 seconds per frame. Directing lines, calculation lines of height centers, line position location, 2 measure, 2 line centers, and rotation lines of 2 tractions, 2 signals, 2 center, 2 operation line calculation screen locations. Sets calculation screen lines into infinity 8 rotation lines of cycles, high generation lines of screens, process lines circulation, and rotation lines of travels through flux. Process indication lines propellers, directing lines magnetic force, high position magnetic stripping highways, 3 centers, 3 travels, 3 direct line course centers, line communication setting, configuration system of the pyramid, and screen adaptations of travel. Set calculation ground centers, online sequence, inside rotation, surface, and travel. Okay? So we go into simulation core, directing ground centers and sequence, platitude line condition set, time reactor, change the part acceleration to torical fields, directing lines of sound waves, process lines of 144 clocking, and rotation lines of circuit. Sets communication height centers and travel and direct lines of link. Platforms over 3 centers, 6 lines of measure, and scales of communication setting to its pyramid activation, rotation, surface, and travel recognition. Sets calculation of ground centers, high lines, and settings. In communication catapult, catalyst, communicate elongate line screen adaptations over lines, A-line, rotation lines, dimensional cell, solar cell, 3 center line communication, code line, center rotation, set calculation line screen adaptations of travel. Sets communication system, all 3 set positions. All right. Travel course centers, directing line positional levels, orbit and the communication detecting screen lines of 3 lines of position, process lines of 1, process lines of 2, process lines of 3, solar rotation, solar flares, rotation lines of cycles, regenerate screen adaptation of travel. Sets position lines of pattern, process lines of communication setting to its cluster cloud, directing ground centers in the communication setting. Sets calculation of grounds, high lines of signals, 3 lines of measure, 3 lines of course centers, and flux over 1. Process lines of 1/6 in line condition setting, part of acceleration system, go around the full cycles, rotation line condition setting, and travel. Back in time, back in center, back in operation line of presence, process line condition setting, activation, streamline, adaptation, rotation system, all through tractions. Reaching communication lines of core, direct lines, calculation setting, 2030, rotation set travel. So positions, the tree of life, right? The tree of life, guys. Sets course centers. Now we're in the tree of life. Foundation lines of 1 cycle, 1 center, 1 traction, 1 division. Sets communication lines of grounds, online centers, process lines of indication setting, online course centers, a purple charge working the timelines, set lines outline signal location system of 2030 interactions. Tree identification system, all through travel. Okay. Indicate ground centers, timelines of sequence, process lines indicate lines, wires of indication setting, underground line service location system, all through tractions. Sets lines of platforms, set lines of communication lines, wire signatures around the system lines of a tree in positional force around line condition of its lotus, location to its cycle. Sets generation screen lines, adaptation and travel, directing lines, core center, line communication simulation core. Sets lines of 3 angles, 3-point communication setting in configuration system of 3 ground communication lines and calculate screen location in its VR system location tractions. Oh yeah, done by equation. All right. Now, in that position, you guys are officially there. Welcome to 2030. Yeah. I know, it's just like, whoa, what just happened? Okay, so we go to the line centers, line rotation lines, connection setting, brain convergence system location, calculation line, direct line condition, electrical line condition, electrical line interference, 120 line center line condition, electrical lights, core centers, HP, line current center line condition, H2O, directing line core centers, cell modification lines, and nano roots, line core center line condition, 120,000 seconds per frame. Per frame, set core centers, lines of travel, direct lines of communication setting, and configure setting, proton, electron, neutrons, photons, protons, all line core centers, all direct locations into pod seating, direct lines and position of gauge process line calculation lines, setting communication setting and bridging, directing lines of ground calculation set position operation lines and set position operation lines, set location setting, in head set location lines of Adam and Eve, directing line communication the pre-genesis line core center, genders location setting, 5 years in traction, 6 years location system, all through tractions. Done by equation. It's all set. So you have the tree of life, the 2030 line rotation. Magnetic force lines, setting lines of sequence, process indication lines of digital lines of platforms into voice activation setting. Sets calculation of ground, setting line connection, elongated screen location system and its convergence, setting line position on all levels, and set lines of travel and direct lines. Now we go through a golden out layer, rotates the cycles of regeneration screens, reconfigured system, and all through remodification setting. It travels models, prototypes, line score centers, divergent legions, and alliance. Glowing mechanism coming in charge. 3 centers of travel, 4 centers of measure, and road raft, communication screen lines, adaptations of flux. Process indications, high centers, and travel communications and directions. Earth and rotation. 2030. Hello. So we have gold line sequence, 3 channels, operation lines, power grid lines, energy grid, communication setting, convergence system over lines of pi, electrical line, core centers, and CCTV, process lines HD, HDMI, 3 centers and line condition setting, configuration system with 3 box frames and travel communications. All done by equation. All right, so there's the track locations to your systems and set travel. Earth and rotation, 2030. It's all done by equation. Okay? So that's 1/2 line center, process lines of indication over goal line rotations, and earth line rotations, surface interactions. Directing ground centers, now we come into the 4 C lines, over lines of sequence, process line of indication setting, lines of time measured scale, set communication lines of 144 clocking. Directing 4 lines of flux over line, directing lines of 2 over measure over scale. Process indication lines of grounds, high line signal location setting, and position lines of high centers. In that connection set location lines and creative cycles, add lines of orange screens, direct locations of 3 lines signals, 4 lines of travel, sets lines of 6 lines of measure, independence comes in line rotations, channel operates lines of screen adaptations and computerized, digitalized, high position location 9 line condition RIOS, sets communication lines in FAA, process lines of flight navigation line conditions over lines of 12, and set communications of convergence system, all through traction, all through location, set calculation lines, convert line centers, line condition set in a high position of covert, core center line connection, line connection setting, black hawk, core center line communication convergence, in location system, all through tractions. Done by equation. It's all set up in rotation. Your simulation Earth at 2030. All through rotation and string theory. Now processing that angle point lines of graph, is 1 indicates lines of road graph screens, adaptations of flux over lines. Process indication system, all through attractions, all through locations in setting. Okay, indication lines of grounds, high lines of sequence, process and position, location of center of travel. Online settings and face recognition system of 2030. There it is. Boom, 2030. Congratulations, we're there now. All right, so general processes face and recognition of time. General AI, 2030. Welcome, everybody. Now, course lines of channel, process lines of high course centers, directing signals, locations. Walking line grounds into road graph screens and positional levels. Rainbow, frost bridge, line condition towers, lines as move now and signal, line condition setting. Process lines of 3 signals, lines of ground. So it gets complicated after this position, this operation line calculation and configuration setting. Process lines of snoring graph interference, 0, 0, 0, 4 lines of setting and sequence. Panel operation lines and configuration lines of 1 over 2, process 3 over lines of 6 over lines of 9. Sets calculation of grounds as surface, location setting to its cloud, and rotation lines of attractions. Directing ground centers, high line centers over 1 over 2 over 3 in platform and computer operation lines setting as ground centers. High sig location and triangulations of flux, rotation lines of travel. Directing ground centers, shift lines anomaly, rotate the set lines and travel, indirect lines of grounds and high sig location system. Sets calculation high connection system to an XD1000 information setting of grounds. Boom, done by equation. Longitude ground centers, high lines of sequence as panel, process lines of indication system, all through flux. Indicate 1 centers, process indication system, all through attractions. Now it has a direct line link, process of 1, process of 2, process of 3, process of 4 set lines of travel. Classification lines and blocking frames, line connections, high direct signals of grounds of set position operation lines of set calculations and configuration system. 1 center, travel lines of 3 centers and measure and scale. Sets calculation of ground centers, high lines of sequence, cloak and dagger, directing lines of clock line centers, and 144 lines of communication of scale. Sets lines of travel, direct lines of link, direct lines of panel, process indication system, all the calculation setting. Open line panels, process indicate high centers, line condition, and high centers of travel. Directing ground centers, high line center location system, all through operation lines of sequence. All through attraction, all through locations. And set positions to face recognition. Okay? Okay, so now we're in the cloud line center. Okay, and set lines of communication and configuration lines of 0. Process lines of high centers, line connections, high set position, Merkabah, tester, and touch region. Gold set lines of center and rotations of 3 centers of measure. In flux over 4 and set travel. Okay, setting up in this line connections of cluster fume. Directing green centers, high line sequence over lines of positions, out line centers in box frame. And set position to the calculation screen location, constellation lines, wind panels, oscillation, wind factors over line screen adaptation system, all through attractions. All right. Sets calculation lines at sun line, 3 centers, 3 course centers. And that position all levels, dimension line rotations, and outline signal, and purple line screen, and line communication high center location system, all through traction. Okay, now it's set up in position lines of measure and scale. All right. Center up the sequence in 4 lines of flush over line, directing course centers and line screen adaptation system, and 5 use and track centers of 6 lines of rotation. Now we calculate the modified screen lines, so it was all lines of panel. That process indications of clock lines and directions. Process of indication system, all through attractions, all done by equation. All right, it's all set up. Okay, so it's reconfigured system back in recalculation setting, all through set position. All through setting every simulation Earth. All right, and travels in rotation lines and window frames and travel in dimensional door line screens adaptation of travel. Okay. Kinetic energy lines, digital lines of formation lines, CGI, course centers, IGI, line rotation lines, and stripping line communication, your highways and travel. There's your highways in 2030. Now I have to have ground lines of sequence and circuitry line communication lines, line conditions, electrical line communications, and interference location system off the electrical line communication of wires. Directing line signals and rotation lines and flux over line rotations and travel. So the avatar comes in the galaxy strip lines of anomaly in synchronicities location system and travel calculation of the cosmos. 3 signals of grounds and 4 line centers in rotation surface and travel. Okay, pathogen lines, direction of time, there's your pyramid in 2030. Rotates a cycle, high generates the course centers of gold line centers, rotation lines of 1 over cross lines of 2, sun modificates the systems over travels and position lines of its moon. Moon operates line signals, process lines of indication setting, flux over line, process of indications here, overlooking lines of travel, indirect lines of grounds, and high lines of sequence locations of blocking screens. Directing ground centers, high lines of sequence, open all course centers, lines of calculation setting, configuration system all through travel. Directing centers, process indicates the setting all through flux, over travel, and communications outcomes of urgence. All set in operation lines of settings, all through calculations. All right, so it's amazing how you set up a simulation graph, outline signals, default lines, position, location, measure, and scale, process indicates the setting, and it's highways and travel communication. Okay, very powerful stuff in set position. So it's open windows and frame. Okay, all right, so it's all set up. Knowing exactly what you're doing in rotation lines of the calculation system all through travel, right? As a direct line panel, process lines of link, in lines of calculation setting, road path, path engines over across location system calculations. Okay, so high line connections of triangulation, box frames, and triangulation lines of one over lines of sequence. Sets communication road graphs, online centers of arrows of indication setting. Set course centers of one online centers of east, process line calculation lines of west over flux, capacitor, and rotation. 3 different directions in one center, 1 circulation line conditions, and the compass rotation lines of calculation setting instructions. XC 1000 narrow platforms at 2030 in measure and scale communications. All done by equation. Bring in line condition setting, dropping off, directing the centers, operation lines of sequence, and platforms. XC 1000 rotation line conditions of 3 clocking centers in 144. Sets provision lines of 3 over 4 over 7 over attractions. Directing ground centers, high lines of sequence, online centers, and travel. Done by equation. So our clocking centers, the crop circles are now at 144. Space line connection system is tracking centers. Now this configurates your system, your 12 line centers and rotations. Inhibitors over lines, equal lines of 3 over 4. Calculation lines of high position lines of 4 box frames. Triangulations of flux 3 line centers, 6 over lines, 9, 12 lines at 24 line centers, and positional equal lines of course centers, equal lines of connection setting, 144 above, 144 below, and 24 to 2 line centers and rotation lines of calculation setting, balances out lines of scale, communication lines of convergence system, and all through travel. So process lines of 144 above, 144 below, equal lines of correlations, 24 line centers, 24 line centers, in position of 0 gravity, and set tractions. Okay, so that's where we are at convergence, setting on online platforms of clock line rotation system and 144 measure and scale. Says communication lines of travel, directing ground says is set traction. So now your position lines and set lines of calculation. Now the equal line course center says a 4 line flux line. Let's say 12 lines of signals, 12 lines of measure and scale through 4 lines of settings and communications. Okay, so that basically puts all communications in 2 lines, 4 line signals of box frame communication. Directing lines of panels, process lines of 2 over measure, 2 over scale, flux over 0, and process lines of 1 over set lines of cycle. Travels line rotation, set and travel. Pi generation lines of 1, set lines of 0, process lines of 2 over track communications. Directing ground centers of bandwidth, longitude line screens, line connection setting, and convergence system all through travel. Compass over 1 over line connection setting and score lines. Directing course centers, calculation lines of calculation screen location system into 144 flux, 144 panels, and 144 line rotation. Cerebral cortex line division lines, locking line screen, directing line course centers, and position location system of attractions. Face recognition of metaphysical line centers, line condition setting to the avid line, no rotation, and symbiote, and 3 lines of flux over 2030. Secting position lines of sectors over vectors and quads, 3 line signals, 3 grounds of surface, and travel communication setting convergence. Set rotation lines, platitude line rotation lines, course centers line calculation lines of tubing, rotation lines of service, process indication line condition setting and convergence system all through tractions. Directing ground centers, platitude line rotations to structure of design lines, 5 years in tractions, 5 location system, all through design lines into waving screen adaptations and road graphs, sets communication setting, and online signal and location. Done by equation through travel. So it's amazing how it's all set up in line condition. Very powerful stuff. Rotation through its cycle. All line course centers, line communications with convergence, all set and travel, and simulation cores of 2030 rotation. Okay, so the clocking line center is now 144. Okay, so you got 144 clocking. Says calculation screen lines adaptations in position of 0. Process of 144. 3 zeros as settings, and that puts lines of 2 measure, 1 scale, and 1 set traction. Okay, now the operation 144 is 4 zeros in travel, 3 centers of operation, 2 lines of travels, and 1 line center operation lines of sequence. Sets calculation ground centers in position over flux over 1, 2, and 3 centers lines of communication. Y screens, high line centers into high course centers and satellite rotation. Sets calculation ground lines into temperature readings over barometer, equal lines of course centers, and calculation lines of bracket over screen location. And lines of travel. Sets communication high centers. Now that rotation lines of travels change the direct signal location setting to time and scale. Sets communication lines of ground lines of setting triangulation lines of 1. Set position of triangulation overline cross lines of 2 and metric meters and scale. Rotates the cycles, high lines of grounds. Now high line centers, waving lines, screen line, adaptation lines, position lines of 4 panels, lines of 1 line, rotation lines of 3 centers of travel communications. Directing ground centers and console. Directing lines of arrows of indication 1 over flux, 3 lines of measure. Cross line indicates lines of 0, process lines of 1/3, 1/6, 1/8, 1/12, 1 rotation lines of subtraction. Directing ground centers, high lines of sequence. Comes in, that communicates in setting and configures system all through time, measure, and scale. Sets calculation ground centers on line 1, process of 2 inner circuit, outer circuit, audio circuit locations of 4 panels. Process indicates lines of flux over 1, over cross lines, angle, point lines of graph communication setting and travel. Directing inside line connection system all through configuring setting into mapping system of 2030. So flight manifests are now set up, line condition setting into your social network systems, into your metric system. Okay, so we got 0 calculation lines of configuration setting and calculus, 3 centers of flux over 1. Process indication lines of calculation electrical line condition setting, sets calculation lines of time lines of measure and pi. Process indication over lines of flux over measure and scale is Schumann resonance and travel communications. Process indication lines of calculation screen lines adaptations. We use the flux over line, cross line condition setting, 2 convergence system, all through dimensional, all through sail, all through rotation surface location, how you come in timeline centers and graph communications. Bubbles, interference, rotation lines of graph and communication setting interactions. What do you see in positions? The central core centers of the communication lines, direct lines, and center line communication in the summer, spring, winter, fall through a robin and rotation, a robin itself. Birding formation lines of grounds and high lines of sequence lines of travel. Process communication system all through attractions. Wingspans, cross line inline connections to its spring, rotation lines of surface and travel. Directing ground centers, high course centers, to direct lines into rainbow screen adaptations of flux. Process indication system, all through setting, all through operation lines of ground calculation setting 2030. Directing ground centers, high lines of sequence, clock lines zeros. Process line indicates lines of docking 1, docking point lines of 4, docking point lines of 6, and travel communications. Sets calculation grounds, highways of travels, 3 line centers. 4 signals, rotation lines of grounds, and high lines of sequence lines of platform. Directing grounds and high line sequence. Change communication lines of time, measure, and scale. Sets communications and routes and routers, line course centers, line sequence location, and docking over lines. Process of line position of 0, 2, line condition setting, 0, 3, and set travel. 2030 set up to metric meters and scale. Process over lines of pi, process over calculation setting, process line condition 0, 1, process lines of 0, and rotations. All through tractions. All done through equation. Booyah. It's all done. All set travel and communication. Very complicated stuff, guys, but you have to understand how it comes in line connections of routers and routers and satellites and rotation surface and travel all through portals and stargates rotations. Directing lines of grounds, power relation timelines, and acceleration system all through line condition inhibitors, and line condition setting and graph communication and screen lines. Sets calculation of ground centers and 45 line angles. In rotation surface and travel, indirect lines of link communication. Okay, platforms over 1, and set lines of simulation graphs over 3, and set travel. Sets communication online settings and circuit, location system calculations. Oh yeah, done by equation. Okay, so 2030 is now set up, and portal of acceleration. All through pi and set tractions, all through pi, all right? 3 convergence lines of zeros, 2 communication lines of 0 lines of platform, 1 0, 1 rotation lines of travel. Directing ground centers, high line sequence, comes in pattern direction line center, location grid, and communication. High centers of travel, direct lines of panels, operation lines of sequence, location system, and convergence at traction locations. Mapping sequence, travel lines, directing lines of the sun, operation lines of the moon, and 3 centers of travel. Okay, high centers, yes. 3 centers, 4 lines, set lines, roadway, graph communication screen, adaptations of flux over line. Sets calculation grounds and highlights a sequence. Process in the angle line is a torcal field line, rotates the gravitational pull that process centers the direct lines that communicate some high centers, and rotation system to energetic dome patterns, process in position locations and setting to 144 flux. Sets communication high centers of discharge, rotation lines and northern lights, rotates the cycles and travel communication of graphs, operates line sequence inside rotation system, and the panels of screen adaptation. All done by equation. All through set, all through triangulation line condition. Okay, and again, you're observing everything you already done through equation. Right there. So it's amazing how you look at that formation lines of grounds, how it's all set up, position, location, measure, and scale, guys. Very complicated stuff, how you go through graph screens. All through setting, all through track. Process of indicates setting force centers, rotations, and ground centers lines of sequence in 2030 line measure and scale. Set sequence lines of 1 over travel for 144 clocking, line condition setting, 120,000 seconds per frame, line conditions of hours per seconds per minutes per frame. Your set lines are body framing, and it's now going through core lines of channels into high core centers of discharge, into electrical line communications at platforms at film strip. Directing 4 grounds of surface, process in that line centers of communications. All through panels, all through operation. Okay, very complicated stuff, but that's where we are in setting. Okay, 2030. It's all set up. It's all set up. Structure line, division lines, torcal fields, rotation lines, calculation lines. You got to calculate and modify how you see the position, location, and setting. The operation line sequence of the tree of life and set position to its operation set lines of communications. Cluster clouds, communication and galaxy alignments, line screen adaptations all levels. Clocking centers of 0 core to center, calculation setting 144. Sets position like grounds, high lines of sequence. Process indicates the system, all through travels, all through flux, all through site travel, and communication with its body framing. Travel calculation lines of grounds. And we online the sequence. Process of 2, 6, and 8 lines of measure and scale. Sets travels in point lines over lines cross location or location line conditions of scale. Sets communication lines of realm graph inside, outside, rotation, surface, and travel. Directing ground centers of platforms over lines of E factors, over line screen depths of 3 centers, line rotation, line condition setting, and configuration system, earth line rotation, surface, and travel, indirect line condition setting, and course communication. Inside travel, inside position, operates line sequence, inside travel. Okay, now we work with inside rotation. Okay, 4 lines of flux, 5 lines of measure and scale. Okay. Work with inside line condition setting and set travel communications. Routes to routers, metric lines, high core centers, lines of travels, and structural line division. Okay. Rotate the cycles and line condition setting. Platforms over lines, E factors. Bodies are walking on frame lines now. In position, frame lines of settings into hours in sequence of seconds, minutes, hours, and subtractions in location. Illumination grounds, illumination graphs, offline, inline, outline, audio line communication of travel. Sets conversion system, all through calculation. Inside calculation setting in electrical line grids. Process in the classic line condition setting in conversion set in electrical line grids, high line operation lines of sequence location set in a panel. Process indication system, all through tractions, indirect lines of security lines of measure, security position lines, operation line setting, and rotation surface and travel. Done by equation. Rotates the cycles and platforms. Ground centers, line condition setting, forcing lines, water containment set, line condition setting, 120 line center, line condition setting to H2O, core center, electrical line lights, line communicates electrical line centers in rotation system into high processing. Sets lines communicates setting in all through travels, indirect lines of link and process communication. All centers and rotation lines of grounds and simulation grounds. Sets calculation open lines of windows and frame communication setting and triangulation reline centers and rotation line condition setting, dimensional door line rotations and travel. So it's amazing stuff how we come into the position. All through tractions, all locations, all at once in set travel. Okay, it's very complicated through drawings, guys. But now we have to understand how to position our settings, operation lines of sequence to 2030. Woo! Breathe, breathe. That's already set up. And that's what you have to understand positions. And that position lines that travels, the brain has already set this up through conversion. It's already done. You're just seeing it through faster track positions now. Now, the 50 millimeters per frame is set lines of hours, lines of track, centers, line connection setting, and line counter centers that communicate setting. Your positions, your modification lines, your voice activations is now the high centers lines of calculations. So we have a structure line divisions, process lines of 1, let's get into set lines of communication over line sequence, 3 centers of clocking, centers of flux. Process indication lines of 1, sets over lines, center line conditions of clocking lines of 3 over 6 over 12. Process indication lines over cross, line conditions of 3 lines of measure, into platforms over pi, and 4 lines of signal location setting attractions. That locates the system to your lines, belt, and rotation lines of set travel. Set calculation of grounds lines of 1, process lines of 2, process lines of 3, energetic lines of 4 over 5. Sets calculation lines, screen adaptations over travel. So you're clocking in centers, sets structure line division locations into data lines, location line rotations in 3 centers of travel, off cross line connection setting in a conversion system, all through tractions. Setting up your satellites and rotation lines of grounds and highlights the sequence of your structures. That process indicates the system all through calculation setting and simulation. Okay, in travel, indirect lines of grounds and circuitry line course centers in calculation. Okay, it's all set up provision to set travel. Okay. Metric meters and scale routes the routers that has a course lines of cluster and rotation and your dimension lines of scale. 3 centers, 4 set lines of 6 over 8 over 12. Process lines of pyramid, this is where it comes into cluster 1, cluster 2, cluster 4. Activation screens, direct lines, and modification elongated screen location setting and traction. Locates the signals, offline centers, clock lines of 3 centers of measure. Platitude 144, direct lines of 24, 24. 12 line signals, 12 line measure, 12 line scale, and 12 line bounce into flywheel travel. 8 line centers of central systems and 4 eighths in travel. Set calculation ground centers in sequence. Correlation lines of 1 zero lines, 1 operation lines of 4 line course centers and lotus. 4 line signals into cloak and dagger, directing lines into a clover leaf, and rotation lines of calculation screen lines. Process lines of indication setting, flowers of timelines, set lines of triangulation line connection setting, IOPS, I course centers and flux over lines and direct lines of link. Sets ground centers, line condition configuration system off the travel, earth line rotation, travel point lines of graph, and center operation. Clock and screens location system of center calculation. It's all set up in travel. Now the clock and grounds of 2030, your crop circles are totally different shape. Now we understand code weaving. Process indication lines of floor mats, 4 signals lines of grounds, a pi generation line condition setting and configure setting, part acceleration setting to thermal, the nuclear lines of rotation lines of travel and communications. Directing ground standard lines of sequence, platforms of data, platforms of center, platforms of operation of clock lines, 144 flux over lines of screen adaptation. Sets calculation of ground centers, highline line sequence over line course centers, in position of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 location system and crop circles direction. Setting operates lines of panels and screen line connection system all through tractions. Done by equation now. So it's clocking new ground lines in 2030 locations. So I'm just showing you how this is all set up in location. So you have energetic line, rotation line centers, and formula of equation and center communication setting calculations. New time reactor sets lines, 144 flux, set course centers, 120,000 lines measure and scale, set lines of hours, seconds, minutes, and frames. It's all set up. Earth 1, 2, Earth 1, 3, Earth line 6, 9, and 12. 3 metric scales in process of Orion's belt. Okay, online centers, online circuits. Circuitry line elements into modification lines into 5th elements of travel. Hooah! Done by equation. Online sequence in position. All through structure of the design line. So, the process indicates lines is the track location setting to its ionosphere that's connected to its omega that processes the alpha, beta, theta, and zeta gamma line condition radius lines of grounds. High signal lines and rotation lines of surface process the indication system off the tractions. Directing lines in fusion sets lines of purple screens, inline course centers, and 8 lines of channels, 8 lines of setting, and rotation lines as crop cells, so the code weaved system all through transactions and location system, all through measure, all through scale, clocking centers, line connection and converging system, all through traction. Okay, all done. So you see it in all different angles and flux, all through set position. Okay, very powerful stuff set up. Very powerful stuff, guys. Absolutely incredible. How that's set up in rotation. Okay. All right, so clocking screen has a flux line rotation 1 center. Now that sets lines, course, center, security line positions. Security panels, inside rotation. Pi generation lines of 3 over center in a sequence. Security panels and line connection setting parameters of parameters. Rotates lines of synchronicities, location setting, string theory. Directing ground center line connection setting, we overcross line connection setting all through blue. Blue plasma rotates the cycles, inside rotation. Calculate the lines of coolants and rotation line connection setting. Your water containment system is now 120 lines of volume. All right, each cell is modification in ground centers and line sequence setting into regeneration lines and settings. That process in reproduction. Inside travel. All done by equation. Okay. So, your window frames are no longer box and triangulation frames. They're circle frames now. The eye receptor's line screen adaptation is set into your spectacles are changing the spectrum and set position lines of calculations. Operation lines of sequence. All through time reactors. So your position lines northwest, south, and east are now 4 time reactors and 5 line rotations in pi that overlines the sig locations of 3 over 4 sets communication setting. So your configuration lines in modification system into notification setting is your outgoing mail at a 24 number sequence now. You're in a 24 number out of 7 lines of settings and processing the 12 in position lines of settings. So now you have to understand how to adapt that. Space lines, timeline centers, and positional lines and height, rotation, surface, and travel. And set calculations all through time reactor. Okay? That's how it's set up. All through its equation. Okay, it's complicated stuff, but get a true understanding how it's set up, location setting, all through calculating your clocking lines. Foundation line connection setting to its spherical spheres locations, right? So you guys are no longer seeing triangulation box because you're 5 years ahead in line conditions 2030. You're now seeing circulation, rotation, line condition setting, and line condition, circulation, line condition setting, and frame box location setting to travel. Set position lines and formation lines of grounds. Set position of portals, and your phones are receptor location system and calculations. All right, so now that's exactly what you're seeing now in 2030. 3 patterns, rotation lines of 3 grounds of surface. Set lines of course centers. Process of indication setting over flux, over travel, and direct lines of grounds. Sets calculation lines of high position of 2 measurement scale. Sets course centers of 3 communication lines of windows and frame communication. Okay. So that's 3 line centers in position to metaphysical line, the connection lines to your avatar line, and position of your symbiote. Congratulations. 3 configuration lines of 1 circuit. Process lines indicates setting all through travel. Voice activated now and set lines of screen and adaptations of flux. Over screen line connection system, all through track locations. All through directions, all through track communication. Right? So voice activation is extremely important now because you have to stand the plasma line centers and location system all through travel. The process how you use the connection setting to the outer space line. Rotates the system in void. Process over lines of sequence. Outscales and the communication lines into helter-skelter. Process of indication lines over cross-line connection setting to avatar line centers and computer framing. iOS and rotation lines of CPU rotations. Travel point lines of graph into symbiote. Process inside line connection setting, void itself, coloration line screen adaptations all at once. Booyah. Symbiote, avatar, and metaphysical setting, all through 3 phone adapters. Process lines, circuitry lines of central line core centers. Directing lines of center operation line connection system. Open lines of panel through portals and Stargate location. Indicates lines of 3 flux over line and direct lines of 3 centers of operation line connection setting. 3-dimensional doors. High lines of grounds and high lines of sequence. Look at this in travel. Booyah. So your phone receptor is now set up in travel communications. And set travel. Communicates lines of convergence system and electrical line grids and rotation lines of calculation of telepathy. Directing signal lines, panel operation lines of 1 over cross lines of platforms over 6 over lines over 9, line condition lines of 12. Sets lines of 12 line signals and rotates lines of spin cycles in travel communications. Indirect line signals and locations in the line condition system all through configuration. Okay, all through grounds, all through sequence, all through panel. All right, so all line condition phones and all line computer operating lines as pi generation lines of 5-year line centers and 2030 rotations. All right, but it's very powerful. He set up communication time reactor, Omega 13. Now, Omega 13 comes in line condition ionospheres, of course, centers the ultraspheres located to its megaspheres. Direct lines of multi-line communication at dimension line spheres. Process lines of 4 platforms. Set lines of 0. 4 lines of zeros indicate equals lines of triangulation. Hieroglyphic lines of solar line rotations travels direct lines of grounds in solar sail and rotation lines of grounds. High course centers and direct line communication in set lines and operation lines of sequence. Sets travels in point lines graph, inline rotation line condition setting and configures setting and rotation lines of yin and yang and process calculation. Rotates the cycles and travel. Okay, direct line and link. Process lines of indicates in travel and direct lines of calculation. Okay, so we take the online sequence, platforms over 3, and the opposite direct centers and 4 centers in travel. And then we cross the angles and line condition setting and process lines of 3 lines of travel, because it's processing the female polarity to the male polarity guides in travel. Right? Process lines of pi and line condition setting. Sets course centers, line condition setting over line sequence 2025 no longer exists. Position lines of 2030 is the center operation lines of setting. Sets calculation of grounds, product acceleration lines, coloration system, all through panel, process line connection setting, torical fields, rotation lines, calculation setting, product acceleration line connection setting, all of the system of travel. Directing ground centers in convergence system into crop circle location system and travel communications. All done by equation. So understand the platforms, we can online the centers to its ionospheres, I-direct spheres, and ultraspheres in location of 3 centers of panel. Process indicates lines into high course centers of tether, attachments, 3 line ground centers and calculations. Okay, inhibitors over 1 or track lines of 24 signature lines of grounds now, guys. That's what you're working with now. Set positions into 24 inhibitors at time frame. Clocking line screens, online centers into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 rotations lines of channel of operation. Directing ground centers in signal location setting and calculations. Structure line divisions, rotation lines of set travel. Process lines of 0, line condition setting of 1, platforms over triangulation, question over mark. Sets calculation in ground centers. Process lines of 4 indicates lines of flux over run setting sequence. Process line 3 centers of angles. 3 centers of travels and 4 set course centers of flux and rotation into constellation lines, oscillator, location setting, and calculations. Set travels and directions, structure line division, locations, inline, outline, circuit, and location setting. All done by equation. All right. Center ops, setting direct lines of platforms over line, position lines of programs. Okay, so we go through the oscillation wind pass inside the rotation lines of 0, process lines of 1, line condition lines of 1 line center, inline condition setting, travel point lines of X, process lines of D factors, line conditions in convergence system, calculation lines and line conditions and temperature readings, barometers, thermometers, rotation lines of travel, set calculation of ground centers, lines of sequence, 0, 0, 0, 3 lines over line signal, 3 0 zeros, set position inline, calculation outline course centers, outline audio line, rotation line conditions, voice activated, 4 zeros and signal location setting over cross line condition, 3 lines of measure, 3 calculation screen lines, adaptation of travel, direct lines and link. Done by equation. Now, if that doesn't get any power from the formula equation, I don't know what won't. Now it's all set up. Okay, I know it's complicated, but you see the number signatures inside travel. Okay, very complicated drawing, right? High advance in technology. High advance in technology itself. Also modifications. Also structure, also design. Okay? Also set up and formula equation. Okay? So we're all done in set position. Everything's set up. And that's all it is. How you see it in panel. All right, so we're in 144 xt 1000 rotation lines of X11 charge. Direct lines and supercharging highways locate system to your magnetic force lines that change the gravitational pull. Indirect lines and line signals location system all through travel. There we go. Okay, all set up. Always in forms and line condition settings. So we're 144 clocking of XT1001. XT1001 plats of XT250, XT500, and XT1000. That processes your modification lines, your independence, understand how to modify your system, how to understand your flights, understand position, location, and your efficacy, performance, and your classification settings when you get in positions in September. Directing ground centers, calculate and modify into registration paths, path engines over colleges, direct low course center location system into your academies, and set position lines of travel. All through tractions, all through locations. Okay, very powerful structure, right? Just want to show you what you guys are in positions of to truly understand how to use that in all formation lines of grounds and schematics over lines over mappings. It's that position. Where to put the numbers of indication setting all through travel, all through direction of locations. That's all set up in set travel. Okay. Crop circles, power activation lines, into atmosphere line, course centers, your Skynet. It's all set up. Your process lines is 2030 now, set in clockings. 144 line centers. So we have 144 measure and position lines of 24. 2 panels operation lines, screen adaptations and settings. Now the 144, okay, this is how it works in Pi. Center operation lines is setting in sequence. In that line, course centers, that's position location system, into 4 centers of operation centers in positions of 5 over 6 over 7 over 8 channels of operation. Process lines and flux lines into webbing line centers of 2 rotations, 3 centers of grounds, 3 centers of measures over cross line condition setting of travel. Now, directing line course centers, online sequence into high course centers, electrical line communication line zones, 10. Directing ground centers and orbiting line conditions of probing, 3 centers, 4 centers of travel communications. Clocking centers in platforms over lines, process the connection system to its set travel. Directing ground centers, online centers, and panel communication. The direction. So we change course centers of time frame that sets travel. And then we change communication lines of time measure that changes communication lines of particle line communication lines of travel. Sets travel as endpoint graph and communication lines of surface. Process indicates in overline centers, inline indication setting of platforms over line, E factors over line, cross lines of indication setting all through traction. Directing ground centers, process line connections to all levels of Omega 13, process lines of metric meters over scale, thermal lines, directing lines of ground centers, surface and travel communications. Inside travel, rotate line cycles, rotate the center in rotation line calculation setting. Sets communication high centers, information lines and positions, panels over sequence, security lines of course centers and communication. Directing ground centers highlight sequence over cross line condition setting, 3 panels, operation lines and floor mats, 45 measure and scale of cross line angles and rotation surface and travel. Sets calculation of ground centered line sequence of panels and process calculation lines of ceiling walls and rotation lines of surface and travel. Sets calculation of ground centers lines of sequence system and calculations. Online sequence, online panel. That process lines high position locations to another primer circuit that process indication setting all through tractions. Directing floor mats, 4 centers line connection setting, process lines 8 lines of windows, set lines of 10 over 12 into 24 lines of measure and scale. Sets communication setting in your pyramids and rotation surface and travel. Process indication lines over 1, process lines over 2, 2 pyramids of 4 settings of travel, 4 direct line connections, high centers line communication lines of travel. Sets lines of wall sequence and window frames in 2030 and set design lines and 5 set lines of sequence. Sets communication online centers and rotation surface and travel communications. Done by equation. Okay, so that's all set up in lines of timeline. Barometers and thermometers and scheduling and rotation lines at 144 clocking. All right, so ground centers of surface, we cross the angles. I told you this is complicated stuff. Routes the routers and location setting the spectrum. So we course centers of time frame that process calculation screen locations and direction. Circular line centers circulatory communication lines and set position to its mainframe, process lines and masthead. Directing circulation line condition setting and convergence system, all through settings. 3 triangulations, process indicates lines of road graph screens, clocking line conditions at 144 scale. Sets inside rotation, particle line centers in box frame, circulation rotation line condition setting, to a dimensional door to open panels in process simulation core that resets recore centers in position location to its memory cortex location. Directing ground centers highlights a sequence inside rotation. Okay, it's all done now in set travel. Okay, all things set position. All right, so we applied to the triangulation lines of 1, cross lines of 2, platforms over 6 over 12. So it's very complicated stuff, but it's a lot of fun if you truly understand what you know what you're doing in frame line. So your schematics just get a lot more complicated at 5 years interactions. Schematics over line and inhibitors over 1 rotations, you guys have to truly understand how to rotate the system lines of calculations. Now we come in the security outline signals, rotates the barometers, thermometers of change and measure and set position to its operation. Then we outline the signals in outline centers into audio line set rotations in and out in audio and set travel communications. Voice activated lines, process lines of over cross line connection and blue plasma line direct signal location setting and platforms and direction. And we go into cloak and dagger. Now cloak and dagger overriding cross lines the angles, sets communication lines at gain frames, process indication over cross line angles. 4 centers, 5, 6 lines, 8, 12, 12, 24, 48, 72, and 144 platforms in set travel communications. Online centers, 45 angles in the opposite set location system, all through tractions, all through locations. Bring in the mapping sequence and travel. Very complicated stuff, but you understand what goes on in position of 2030 and metric meters and scale. Process indication over lacrosse lines, directing lines into course lines of channels and location system and calculation. Inside line condition setting and structured design line that boxes window frames and 3 travels. Okay, online centers, line sequence, line condition, lights, shades, and shadows, 3 lines of measure and scale, 2-dimensional lines of doors, 4 lines of signals, 4 line condition setting, and light, shades, and rotation. Travels of point lines of graph and structure of a building inside rotation lines of calculations. Interaction locations. And again, you're observing everything already done through its equation. Okay? Very powerful stuff. Set travel. Set communication. All through setting, all through operation. Okay? It's amazing what you guys can do once you understand how to use your positions, your set tractions. All through directions, all through link, all through panel, all through operation. Okay, very, very powerful stuff through forming equations. How to get to 2030 and set travel, right? So your data formation lines at grounds now are now in sequence and line condition setting to 144 clock in line centers. Set process lines 120,000 seconds per square. That calculates the screen line adaptation to its travels. That process communications. When you guys go through upgrades, you're going to get upgrade line graph screen location setting from 2030 now. That's 5 years in line conditions and 6 over rotations through pi now, guys. You got speed lines or body lines, rotation lines of graph, and communication 3 measure and scale, and process communication setting in configure the system all through the grounds and the powers and the atmospheres. All through travel, all through position. All done by equation. But it's amazing when you get positional formula equations, know exactly what you're doing through line conditions. It's very powerful stuff as it travels its attractions. Okay, guys, it's all set up now. All through setting, all through operation. So, knowing exactly how to set all communication setting, your phone receptors, and location of voice and line panels, voice and grids, and position your time reactors in location setting to omega 13. Okay, that's it by equation. All right, so directing line course centers. I'll see you guys in the call scene. Adios.